I need to tell you something that will shatter everything you think you know about family loyalty. What would you do if you discovered that the person you trusted most in the world had been systematically destroying your reputation for months, poisoning everyone against you, all while pretending to love you? My name is Lorraine Washington. I'm 68 years old, and until 3 months ago, I believed my grandson, Jerome, was the light of my life. I raised that boy from the age of 7 when his mother, my daughter Patricia, died in that terrible car accident. I gave him everything I had, worked double shifts at the hospital for 15 years to put him through college, and watched with pride as he graduated with honors in business administration. But what I didn't know was that behind my loving smile and grandmother's hugs, Jerome had been weaving a web of lies so elaborate, so cruel, that when I finally discovered the truth, it nearly broke me completely. The morning everything began to unravel started like any other Tuesday in October. I remember because the autumn leaves were falling like golden rain outside my kitchen window, and I was preparing Jerome's favorite breakfast before his big presentation to potential investors for his new tech startup. The aroma of fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls filled my modest but spotless home on Maple Street, the same house where I'd raised him after Patricia's death. My hands trembled slightly as I arranged the plates, not from age, but from the excitement I felt for my grandson's big day. I had invested my entire life, savings, $43,000, into his business venture called Next Gen Solutions, trusting completely in his vision and his promises that this would secure both our futures. Jerome walked into the kitchen that morning looking every inch the successful entrepreneur in his crisp navy suit and polished shoes. His smile was radiant, infectious, and when he hugged me, I felt that familiar warmth of unconditional love that had sustained me through so many difficult years. "Grandma Lorraine," he said, his voice filled with what I believed was genuine affection. "Today is going to change everything for us. After the presentation, we'll finally be able to move you to that nice retirement community you've always dreamed of." I felt tears of joy welling up in my eyes as I watched him eat breakfast with enthusiasm, discussing his plans for the company's future, completely unaware that every word coming out of his mouth was a carefully constructed lie. What I didn't know, as I lovingly packed his lunch and straightened his tie, was that Jerome had no business presentation that day. What I didn't know was that my $43,000 had already been spent on a luxury car, expensive clothes, and lavish dinners with his girlfriend Madison, a woman I had never met but whom he described as shy and not ready to meet family yet. What I didn't know was that for the past 6 months, Jerome had been telling everyone in our community, our church, and even our extended family that I was suffering from early-stage dementia and becoming increasingly paranoid and delusional. The first crack in my perfect world appeared when Mrs. Eleanor Foster, my neighbor of 12 years, approached me that afternoon while I was tending to my rose garden. Eleanor had always been a kind woman, but there was something different in her eyes that day, a mixture of pity and concern that made my stomach clench with inexplicable dread. "Lorraine, honey," she said in that careful tone people use when they're about to deliver difficult news, "I wanted to ask how you're feeling these days. Jerome mentioned you've been having some memory issues." I felt the gardening shears slip from my hands and clatter onto the brick pathway. Memory issues? I had never experienced any cognitive problems. My mind was as sharp as it had always been, and I couldn't understand why Jerome would tell our neighbors such a thing. Eleanor continued with evident discomfort, her weathered hands fidgeting with the pearl necklace she always wore. "He's such a devoted grandson, Lorraine. He told me he's been worried sick about you forgetting to pay bills, leaving the stove on, getting confused about appointments. He said he's been having to manage more and more of your affairs because you're just not yourself anymore." Each word hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my legs grow weak beneath me. I managed to stammer that there must be some misunderstanding, that my memory was perfectly fine, but I could see in Eleanor's sympathetic expression that she didn't believe me. She had already accepted Jerome's version of reality, and now she was looking at me as if I were a confused elderly woman in denial about her own deteriorating condition. That evening, when Jerome returned home, I confronted him about the conversation with Eleanor. I remember standing in our living room, surrounded by family photos that chronicled our life together, and feeling like I was stepping into some alternate reality where nothing made sense anymore. "Jerome," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mrs. Foster said you told her I'm having memory problems. Why would you say that?" The change in his expression was subtle, but unmistakable. For just a fraction of a second, I saw something cold and calculating flash across his features before the familiar warm smile returned. "Oh, Grandma," he said, moving toward me with what appeared to be genuine concern. "You did forget to pay the electric bill last month, remember? And you called me 3 times last week asking about the same doctor's appointment." I felt my world tilt on its axis as he spoke, because I knew with absolute certainty that neither of those things had happened. I had always been meticulous about paying bills, often weeks in advance, and I had never called him repeatedly about any appointment. But the way he spoke, with such gentle conviction, made me question my own sanity for a terrifying moment. "I've been worried about you," he continued, taking my hands in his, "but I didn't want to frighten you by discussing it directly. Maybe we should schedule an appointment with Dr. Martinez to check things out." The concern in his voice seemed so real, so loving, that I found myself nodding agreement even as every instinct screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire scenario. Over the next several days, I began paying closer attention to my interactions with Jerome, and what I discovered made my blood run cold. I started keeping a detailed journal, recording every conversation, every event, every moment of confusion or clarity. I documented phone calls, bill payments, and daily activities with the precision I had once applied to patient charts during my nursing career. What emerged was a pattern so methodical and malicious that I could barely comprehend it. Jerome had been systematically rewriting our shared reality, creating fictional incidents and then referencing them as if they had actually occurred, gaslighting me with such skill that I began to understand how someone could indeed question their own sanity. The true scope of his deception became clear when I decided to check on the business investment I had made in Next Gen Solutions. I called the address Jerome had given me for his office, only to discover it was a virtual mailbox service with no actual business operations. When I asked to speak with his business partner David, whom Jerome had mentioned countless times, the receptionist informed me that no one by that name had ever been associated with that address. I felt my heart pounding so hard I thought I might collapse right there in my kitchen as the reality crashed over me like a tsunami. My grandson, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, had stolen my life savings and was now systematically destroying my reputation to cover his tracks. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. As I began investigating further, reaching out to old friends and family members to understand the extent of the lies Jerome had spread, I discovered that his plan was far more elaborate than simple theft. Through careful conversations with my sister Rose and my friend Clara from church, I learned that Jerome had been positioning himself as my caregiver and legal guardian in waiting. He had told everyone that my condition was deteriorating rapidly and that I would soon need full-time care. He had even consulted with an attorney about power of attorney documents, claiming that I had requested his help in organizing my affairs before my memory got worse. If you're watching this story unfold and feeling that familiar chill of recognition, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel, because what I'm about to tell you next will show you exactly how predators manipulate the people who love them most. The psychological warfare I was experiencing is more common than you might think, and sharing these stories helps protect other families from similar devastation. The morning I decided to confront Jerome with everything I had discovered was crisp and clear, with that particular quality of light that makes everything appear sharper, more defined. I had spent 3 sleepless nights planning exactly what I would say, how I would present the evidence I had gathered, and what I hoped to achieve beyond simply exposing his lies. Part of me still harbored a desperate hope that there might be some explanation, some misunderstanding that could restore the grandson I thought I knew. I prepared his favorite breakfast one more time, perhaps as a gesture of the unconditional love that had defined our relationship for 21 years, or perhaps as my own way of saying goodbye to the illusion of the family I thought I had. Jerome entered the kitchen that morning with the same confident stride and warm smile that had greeted me every morning for months, even as he systematically demolished my life behind my back. I watched him pour coffee and reach for the cinnamon roll, and I felt an overwhelming sadness for both of us because I knew that in the next few minutes our relationship would be irrevocably changed. "Jerome," I began, my voice surprisingly steady, despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. I need to talk to you about next-gen solutions and some of the conversations you've been having with our neighbors and family. The coffee cup froze halfway to his lips, and I saw that flash of calculation return to his eyes. But this time, he couldn't quite mask it with his usual charm. "What about next-gen, Grandma?" he asked, setting down the cup with deliberate care, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I had begun to recognize as manipulation disguised as concern. "I told you the presentation went well. We should hear back from the investors within a few weeks." I pulled out the folder I had prepared, containing printed emails from the virtual office service, phone records of my attempted calls to his supposed business partners, and a timeline of all the fictional incidents he had attributed to my failing memory. "Jerome," I said, sliding the folder across the kitchen table, "there is no next-gen solutions. There is no office, no business partners, no investors, and no presentation. There's just my $43,000 that you stole and a web of lies you've been spinning to everyone we know." The transformation in Jerome's demeanor was like watching a mask slip away to reveal something unrecognizable underneath. The warm, loving grandson vanished, replaced by a stranger whose eyes held a coldness that made me physically recoil. "Grandma," he said, his voice now carrying an edge I had never heard before, "you're confused again. This is exactly the kind of paranoid thinking I've been worried about. You're seeing conspiracies where there aren't any, making connections that don't exist." He gestured toward the folder dismissively. "Whatever you think you found there, it's probably just your mind playing tricks on you again." The gaslighting continued, even as I confronted him with irrefutable evidence, and I realized that Jerome had become so skilled at manipulation that he could probably convince himself that his version of events was true. "I've been keeping a detailed record of everything," I told him, opening the folder to show him my meticulous documentation. "I know about the virtual mailbox, I know there are no business partners, and I know you've been telling everyone I have dementia when my mind is perfectly clear." Jerome stood up from the table, his movements sudden and aggressive in a way that made me instinctively step back. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he said, shaking his head with what appeared to be genuine sadness. "You're getting paranoid and suspicious of the people who love you most. This is a classic symptom, Grandma. You need help." What happened next revealed the true depth of Jerome's betrayal and the extent to which he had planned this systematic destruction of my life. He pulled out his cell phone and began dialing, and when I asked who he was calling, he looked at me with what I can only describe as pity mixed with something much darker. "I'm calling Dr. Martinez," he said. "I think it's time we discussed your condition more seriously. And I'm also going to call Uncle Robert because I think the family needs to know how much worse you've gotten." The realization hit me like a physical blow that this confrontation wasn't the end of Jerome's plan, but rather the next phase of it. He was going to use my attempt to expose his lies as further evidence of my supposed mental deterioration. I felt a surge of clarity and determination that surprised me with its intensity. This boy, this young man I had raised and loved unconditionally, was not going to destroy me without a fight. I reached across the table and closed my folder, looking Jerome directly in the eyes as I spoke. "Before you make those calls," I said, my voice carrying a strength I didn't know I still possessed, "there's something you should know. I've been recording our conversations for the past week." Jerome's face went pale, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw genuine fear in his expression. "That's right," I continued, pulling out my smartphone with the voice recording app still running. "Every lie you've told, every manipulation, every cruel word is documented and saved." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock on the kitchen wall that had marked time through so many family meals and conversations over the years. Jerome stared at the phone in my hand as if it were a venomous snake, and I could see his mind racing as he calculated the implications of what I had just revealed. "You recorded me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's illegal, Grandma. You can't record someone without their consent." I smiled sadly, feeling older than my 68 years, but also stronger than I had felt in months. "Actually, Jerome, in this state, I only need the consent of one party to the conversation, and that party is me. I may be old, but I'm not stupid, and I certainly don't have dementia." What followed was Jerome's desperate attempt to regain control of the situation, and watching him scramble to reconstruct his carefully built house of lies was both satisfying and heartbreaking. He tried anger first, demanding that I delete the recordings and accusing me of betraying his trust, which would have been laughable if it weren't so tragic. When anger failed, he switched to emotional manipulation, tears streaming down his face as he claimed he had only been trying to protect me from financial scams, and that his lies about my mental state were motivated by love and concern for my well-being. "Grandma," he sobbed, reaching for my hands, "I was trying to keep you safe. There are so many people who prey on elderly people, and I thought if everyone believed you needed protection, no one would try to take advantage of you." But I had moved beyond the reach of his manipulation, and each lie he told only confirmed what I had already discovered about the stranger my grandson had become. "Jerome," I said, pulling my hands away from his grasp, "you are the predator who took advantage of me. You stole my life savings, destroyed my reputation, and tried to convince everyone, including me, that I was losing my mind. There is no justification for what you've done, and there are no words that can undo the damage you've caused." I stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window, looking out at the garden I had tended for so many years, trying to process the enormity of what had happened to my family. The conversation that followed revealed even more disturbing details about Jerome's plans and the extent of his betrayal. Under pressure, and perhaps realizing that his web of lies was finally unraveling, he admitted that he had been working with his girlfriend Madison to establish grounds for having me declared mentally incompetent. They had researched guardianship laws and consulted with attorneys about the process of gaining control over my finances and healthcare decisions. "We weren't going to hurt you," he insisted, as if theft and emotional abuse didn't constitute harm. "We just wanted to make sure you were taken care of properly in your old age." The depth of his self-deception was almost as shocking as the betrayal itself, and I realized that Jerome had constructed an elaborate justification for his actions that allowed him to maintain the fiction that he was the hero of this story, rather than the villain. In his mind, he wasn't a thief and manipulator, but rather a concerned grandson, saving his grandmother from her own poor judgment and protecting the family assets from being squandered. The scariest part was that he seemed to genuinely believe this narrative, which made me understand how he had been able to lie so convincingly to everyone around us. As our confrontation reached its climax, Jerome made one final desperate play that revealed the true extent of his ruthlessness and his complete lack of genuine love for me. "Fine," he said, his tears drying instantly and his voice turning cold and threatening. "If you try to expose me or get me in trouble over this, I'll make sure everyone knows just how unstable and paranoid you really are. I have 2 years' worth of documentation about your erratic behavior, your memory problems, and your increasing inability to manage your own affairs. Who do you think people will believe, Grandma? A successful young businessman trying to care for his aging grandmother, or a confused old woman making wild accusations?" The cruelty in his voice was like nothing I had ever heard before, and I realized that the loving grandson I thought I knew had either never existed or had died somewhere along the way, replaced by this calculating stranger who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to his financial goals. But Jerome had underestimated the woman who had worked as a charge nurse for 35 years, who had raised 3 children largely on her own, and who had survived poverty, discrimination, and loss without ever giving up or giving in. I pulled out my phone again and played back a portion of our conversation, his own voice clearly stating his intention to continue lying about my mental state and threatening me with further manipulation. "Jerome," I said, my voice steady and strong, "you just made the biggest mistake of your life. You see, I didn't just record our conversations this week. I've been recording everything since the day Mrs. Foster told me about your lies, and I have documentation going back months that proves exactly who has been lying and who has been telling the truth." The look of horror on Jerome's face as he realized the full scope of what I had accomplished was almost worth the pain he had caused me. Almost. But nothing could truly compensate for the loss of the relationship I thought we had, the destruction of my trust in family, and the months of psychological torture he had put me through. What happened next would determine not just my future, but also whether other families would be protected from similar predators, and as I reached for my phone to make the most difficult call of my life, I knew that everything was about to change forever. Should I continue with part 2 of Lorraine's story? The next part will reveal the shocking discovery she makes about Jerome's other victims and the elaborate plan she devises to expose not just him, but the entire network of people who helped him carry out this betrayal. Please let me know when you're ready to hear what happens next. Tentar novamente, wakiadatar. The phone call I made that morning was to Detective Maria Santos at the local police department, a woman I had met years earlier when she was a rookie officer responding to a break-in at the hospital where I worked. I remember my hands shaking as I dialed her direct number, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally taking action after months of being a victim. "Detective Santos," I said when she answered. "This is Lorraine Washington. I need to report a case of elder financial abuse and fraud, and I believe the perpetrator may have other victims." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity before Maria's professional voice responded, "Mrs. Washington, I'm going to need you to come down to the station as soon as possible. Can you bring any documentation you have?" Jerome sat frozen at our kitchen table as I made arrangements to meet with Detective Santos that afternoon, and I could see his mind racing as he calculated his options. The confident manipulator who had controlled every aspect of our relationship for months was finally experiencing what it felt like to be powerless, and watching him struggle with that reality gave me a grim satisfaction that surprised me with its intensity. "Grandma," he said, his voice taking on a pleading quality I had never heard before, "you don't understand what you're doing. If you go to the police, this will destroy our family. Think about what this will do to your reputation, to mine, to everyone who knows us." I turned to face him, this stranger who had stolen my grandson's face, and felt nothing but pity for the pathetic creature he had become. "Jerome," I replied, gathering my documentation into a neat folder, "you destroyed our family the day you decided to steal from me and lie about my mental health. I'm not destroying anything that wasn't already broken beyond repair." The drive to the police station took me through neighborhoods where I had lived and worked for decades, past the hospital where I had saved lives and comforted families, past the church where I had found solace after Patricia's death, past the elementary school where Jerome had once played on the playground, while I watched with pride and hope for his future. Each familiar landmark felt like a goodbye to the life I had known, the innocent belief that family meant safety and love meant protection. Detective Santos met me in a small conference room that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, and as I spread my evidence across the scratched wooden table, I felt like I was performing surgery on my own heart. The recordings, the financial documents, the timeline of lies and manipulation, all of it laid bare the systematic destruction of everything I had believed about my closest relationship. "Mrs. Washington," Detective Santos said, after reviewing the initial evidence, "this is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of elder abuse I've ever seen. Your grandson is facing serious federal charges for wire fraud, identity theft, and elder financial abuse." The relief I felt hearing those words was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the devastating knowledge that seeking justice meant losing the last family member I thought I had. What Detective Santos told me next sent shockwaves through my understanding of just how extensive Jerome's criminal activities had become. "Mrs. Washington," she said, pulling out a thick file folder, "your case isn't isolated. We've been investigating a pattern of similar crimes in this area, and your grandson's name has come up in connection with at least 3 other elderly victims." The room seemed to spin around me as she explained that Jerome had been using the same tactics on other seniors, gaining their trust, stealing their money, and then discrediting them by spreading rumors about their mental competency to prevent them from seeking help or being believed when they tried to report the crimes. The first victim was Mrs. Evelyn Price, an 81-year-old widow who lived alone in a retirement community across town. Jerome had befriended her at a coffee shop, presenting himself as a successful entrepreneur who could help her invest her late husband's pension fund for better returns. Over 6 months, he had convinced her to give him nearly $60,000 for various investment opportunities that never existed. When Mrs. Price began asking questions about her returns, Jerome told her family and the retirement community staff that she was showing signs of dementia and becoming confused about her finances. By the time she tried to report the theft, everyone around her believed she was simply a confused elderly woman who had misplaced her money or forgotten about legitimate transactions. The second victim was Mr. Harold Chen, a 73-year-old retired teacher who had hired Jerome to help modernize his small business's computer systems. Jerome had convinced Mr. Chen that his systems were vulnerable to hackers and that he needed to transfer his business accounts to secure offshore investments while the upgrades were completed. After stealing $45,000 from Mr. Chen's business accounts, Jerome launched a campaign of character assassination, telling suppliers and customers that Mr. Chen was suffering from early-stage Alzheimer's and making poor business decisions that were driving the company toward bankruptcy. When Mr. Chen tried to report the theft, even his own family questioned whether his accusations were real or symptoms of cognitive decline. The third victim was the most heartbreaking because it involved someone I knew personally, Mrs. Dorothy Fleming, who sang in our church choir and had always been one of the sharpest, most articulate women I had ever met, had fallen victim to Jerome's scheme 8 months earlier. He had approached her after learning that she had inherited a substantial sum from her sister's estate, offering to help her establish a charitable foundation in her sister's memory. Dorothy had trusted him with $78,000, believing she was creating a lasting legacy that would help underprivileged children get educational scholarships. When the foundation never materialized and Dorothy began asking questions, Jerome told Pastor Williams and other church members that Dorothy was becoming increasingly paranoid and delusional, making wild accusations against people who were trying to help her. Sitting in that police station conference room, listening to Detective Santos describe the systematic destruction of these innocent people's lives, I felt a rage building inside me that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. This wasn't just about my own betrayal anymore. It was about a predator who had identified vulnerable seniors and developed a sophisticated system for exploiting their trust while simultaneously destroying their credibility. "Detective Santos," I said, my voice trembling with fury. "How many more victims might there be? How long has this been going on?" She looked at me with the weary expression of someone who had seen too much human cruelty and explained that financial crimes against the elderly were often underreported because the victims were either too ashamed to come forward or had been so effectively discredited that no one believed their accusations. The investigation that followed revealed layers of Jerome's operation that I never could have imagined in my worst nightmares. He had created fake business entities, established relationships with corrupt lawyers who helped him navigate guardianship proceedings, and even had connections with unscrupulous healthcare providers who would provide documentation supporting claims of cognitive decline in his victims. Detective Santos showed me evidence that Jerome had been planning to have me declared mentally incompetent within the next 2 months, using falsified medical records and testimony from people he had paid to corroborate his lies about my condition. The most chilling discovery was that Jerome's girlfriend Madison wasn't just an accomplice, but actually the mastermind behind the entire operation. Madison Torres was a former paralegal who had been disbarred for falsifying legal documents, and she had developed this elder abuse scheme as a way to target victims who were unlikely to be believed if they tried to seek help. Jerome was just her latest recruit, chosen specifically because his relationship with me provided the perfect cover for gaining access to my finances and social network. She had coached him on how to gaslight victims, how to spread rumors about their mental competency, and how to position himself as the concerned caregiver while systematically destroying their lives. If you're feeling as outraged as I was learning about this network of predators, please take a moment to share this story with others, because awareness is our first line of defense against these sophisticated criminals who target our most vulnerable community members. The tactics they use are becoming more common and more refined, and sharing these experiences helps protect other families from similar devastation. Detective Santos explained that building a case against Jerome and Madison would require careful coordination with federal authorities because their crimes crossed state lines and involved complex financial fraud. "Mrs. Washington," she said, "we're going to need your help to gather additional evidence and potentially assist with a controlled operation to catch them in the act of attempting to defraud other victims." The idea of working undercover to expose the people who had betrayed me so completely was both terrifying and exhilarating. But I knew without hesitation that I would do whatever was necessary to protect other seniors from experiencing the psychological torture I had endured. The plan that Detective Santos and the federal investigators developed was elegantly simple, yet dangerous, in ways I didn't fully appreciate until later. I would continue living in my home and maintaining the appearance of a confused, vulnerable elderly woman while wearing a wire and allowing Jerome to proceed with his plans to have me declared mentally incompetent. The goal was to record evidence of their conspiracy while gathering information about other potential victims and the network of corrupt professionals who facilitated their crimes. Mrs. Washington, Detective Santos warned me, this operation will require you to endure continued psychological abuse and manipulation. Are you certain you're prepared for what this will involve? I thought about Mrs. Price, crying alone in her retirement community room while everyone around her believed she was losing her mind. I thought about Mr. Chen, watching his life's work destroyed by rumors and lies while his own family doubted his sanity. I thought about Dorothy Fleming, sitting in church every Sunday, while people whispered about her supposed paranoia and delusions. Detective Santos, I said, feeling a strength and determination I hadn't known I possessed. Those monsters have already put me through hell. If enduring a little more of their torture can prevent them from destroying other families, then that's exactly what I'm going to do. The next phase of my life became a surreal performance where I had to pretend to be the confused, declining woman Jerome had painted me as, while secretly documenting every aspect of his criminal operation. Returning home that evening after my meeting with Detective Santos, I found Jerome pacing our living room like a caged animal, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in urgent, hushed tones to someone I assumed was Madison. When he saw me enter, he quickly ended the call and approached me with the expression that mixed fake concern with barely concealed desperation. "Grandma," he said, "I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, and I realize how frightened and confused you must be feeling. I want you to know that I forgive you for all those accusations, and I'm here to help you through this difficult time." The effort it took to maintain my composure while listening to his continued manipulation was extraordinary, but I knew that every word was being recorded by the wire I now wore constantly. "Jerome," I replied, forcing my voice to sound tired and uncertain. "I don't know what's happening to me anymore. Sometimes I feel so confused about things, and I can't tell what's real and what's not." The relief that flooded his face at hearing me express doubt about my own perceptions was both satisfying and sickening, confirming that his primary goal had always been to make me question my own sanity. Over the next several days, Jerome's behavior became increasingly bold as he believed he was regaining control over the situation. He began openly discussing his plans to help me manage my affairs, bringing legal documents for me to sign that would give him power of attorney over my finances and healthcare decisions. He scheduled an appointment with a doctor he claimed specialized in geriatric care, though I later learned this was actually a corrupt physician who was paid to provide fraudulent assessments supporting claims of cognitive decline in elderly patients. "Grandma," Jerome explained as he guided my hand toward the signature line on yet another legal document. "This is just to make sure someone can help you if you have one of your confused episodes and can't make decisions for yourself." The psychological challenge of allowing Jerome to continue his abuse while secretly working to expose him was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my 68 years of life. Every morning I woke up knowing that I would spend the day being gaslit, manipulated, and emotionally tortured by someone I had loved unconditionally, all while maintaining the facade that his treatment was effective in making me doubt my own reality. The federal agents monitoring the situation provided daily check-ins and psychological support, but nothing could truly prepare me for the strain of living as a victim while secretly being an investigator. The breakthrough in the case came when Jerome made the mistake of bringing Madison to our house for what he told me was a consultation about my care needs. I had never met her before, but the moment she walked into my living room, I understood exactly why Jerome had been able to execute such a sophisticated scheme. Madison Torres was a master manipulator who could shift between concerned caregiver and ruthless predator with stunning efficiency. She spoke to me in the patronizing tone reserved for children and the mentally impaired, asking invasive questions about my daily routines, my relationships with neighbors, and my understanding of my financial situation. "Mrs. Washington," Madison said, settling into my favorite armchair as if she owned it, "Jerome has told me so much about you and how much he cares about your well-being. I specialize in helping families navigate the challenges of cognitive decline, and I want you to know that what you're experiencing is very common for women your age. Every word out of her mouth was designed to reinforce the narrative that I was a confused elderly woman who needed to be managed rather than respected. And listening to her clinical discussion of my supposed symptoms while knowing she was the architect of this entire scheme required every ounce of self-control I possessed. What Madison didn't know was that her visit was being recorded by multiple devices, and her presence in my home provided the evidence investigators needed to prove the conspiracy between her and Jerome. She made the fatal error of discussing other clients she had helped in similar situations, mentioning Mrs. Price and Mr. Chen by name, and detailing strategies she had used to discredit their attempts to seek help. The key, she explained to Jerome, while apparently forgetting I was in the room, is to establish the narrative early and get as many people as possible invested in believing the story before the mark realizes what's happening. Once everyone around them thinks they're losing their mind, it becomes almost impossible for them to convince anyone that they're being victimized. As Madison outlined her methods for destroying elderly victims' credibility and isolating them from potential support systems, I felt a cold fury building inside me that gave me strength I didn't know I still possessed. This woman had turned the systematic abuse of vulnerable seniors into a business model, and she discussed our suffering with the casual indifference of someone planning a grocery list. "Mrs. Washington," she said, suddenly turning her attention back to me. "I know this must all seem very overwhelming, but I want you to trust that Jerome and I have your best interests at heart. Sometimes, the people who love us most have to make difficult decisions to protect us from ourselves." The final phase of Jerome and Madison's plan involved having me committed to a psychiatric facility for evaluation, where corrupt medical professionals would provide the documentation needed to have me declared mentally incompetent. Jerome had already filled out the preliminary paperwork and scheduled the involuntary commitment proceedings for the following week. "Grandma," he explained with fake sadness, "the doctors think it would be best if you spent some time in a place where professionals can properly assess your condition and make sure you're getting the care you need." The irony that he was describing imprisonment and abuse as care was lost on him. But the federal agents monitoring our conversations now had everything they needed to move forward with arrests. The morning of the coordinated arrests was crisp and clear, with that particular quality of autumn light that makes everything appear in sharp focus. I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise through the window where I had observed so many mornings with Jerome, when Detective Santos called to inform me that the operation was about to begin. "Mrs. Washington," she said, "federal agents will be arresting Jerome and Madison within the next hour. We need you to remain in your house and stay away from windows until we give you the all clear." The mixture of relief, anticipation, and residual fear I felt as I waited for justice to finally arrive was overwhelming, and I found myself thinking about all the other victims who would finally see their abusers held accountable for their crimes. Jerome was arrested as he left Madison's apartment building, where they had been planning the details of my involuntary commitment and discussing how to access my remaining assets once I was institutionalized. The federal agents who had been monitoring their communications for weeks had recorded hours of conversations detailing their criminal conspiracy and their plans to expand their operation to target additional victims in neighboring states. Madison was arrested simultaneously at her office, where investigators found files containing detailed profiles of dozens of potential elderly victims, including their financial information, family relationships, and psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited. But the most shocking revelation came when investigators searched Madison's computer files and discovered that Jerome hadn't just been stealing from me and the other known victims. He had been systematically draining my accounts for over a year, taking small amounts that I hadn't noticed while building profiles of my friends and neighbors for future targeting. The sophisticated level of planning and the callous indifference to the human cost of their crimes was breathtaking in its cruelty. And I realized that I had been living with a stranger who saw me not as family, but as a resource to be exploited until I was completely depleted. Are you ready to hear how this story ends and what happened when I finally got my day in court? Comment below and let me know what you think Jerome and Madison deserve as punishment for their crimes, and please subscribe if you want to hear more stories about justice prevailing over those who prey on our most vulnerable community members. The final part of my story will reveal the shocking courtroom confrontation and the unexpected twist that changed everything about how I viewed my future. Should I continue with part 3? The final part will reveal the dramatic courtroom confrontations, the sentences handed down to Jerome and Madison, and Lorraine's surprising decision about how to use her experience to protect other seniors from similar predators. Let me know when you're ready for the conclusion. Tentar novamente, wakatitar. The courtroom where Jerome and Madison would face justice was a solemn space with high ceilings and dark wood paneling that seemed to absorb sound and light, creating an atmosphere of gravity that matched the seriousness of the charges they faced. I sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing my best navy blue dress and the pearl necklace Patricia had given me for my 60th birthday, determined to look like the strong, competent woman I had always been, rather than the confused victim Jerome had tried to make me appear. Federal prosecutors had spent 3 months building their case, and as I looked across the courtroom at my grandson, sitting at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction, sadness, and something I could only describe as closure finally beginning to take root in my heart. The lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Martinez, was a sharp woman in her 40s who had specialized in elder abuse cases for over a decade, and she had warned me that the defense would likely try to portray Jerome as a misguided young man who had made poor choices rather than a calculating predator who had systematically destroyed multiple lives. Mrs. Washington, she had told me during our preparation sessions, they're going to try to make this about family dysfunction and youthful mistakes rather than deliberate criminal conspiracy. I need you to be prepared for them to attack your credibility and suggest that you're a vindictive grandmother seeking revenge rather than a victim seeking justice. The opening statements revealed the stark contrast between the prosecution's methodical presentation of evidence and the defense's desperate attempt to humanize 2 people who had shown no humanity toward their victims. Jerome's attorney, a slick young man named David Hartley, who specialized in white-collar crime, painted a picture of a troubled young man who had lost his way after his mother's death and had been manipulated by the older, more experienced Madison into participating in criminal activities he didn't fully understand. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Hartley said in his smooth, practiced voice, "my client is not the mastermind the prosecution wants you to believe he is. He's a grieving son who made terrible choices while under the influence of a woman who exploited his emotional vulnerabilities and his close relationship with his grandmother." Madison's defense strategy was even more audacious and infuriating than Jerome's, as her attorney, a woman named Patricia Bloom, who had built her reputation defending financial crimes, argued that Madison was actually trying to protect elderly clients from their own poor judgment, and that any money she received was payment for legitimate consulting services. "My client," Bloom declared with stunning audacity, "is a geriatric care specialist who was hired by families to help manage the affairs of elderly relatives who were showing signs of cognitive decline. The prosecution wants to criminalize the difficult but necessary work of protecting vulnerable seniors from financial predators and scam artists." The first week of testimony focused on the technical aspects of the financial crimes, with FBI forensic accountants walking the jury through the complex web of fake businesses, fraudulent documents, and money laundering schemes that Jerome and Madison had used to steal from their victims. Watching the prosecutors methodically dismantle every lie Jerome had told me, seeing the evidence of his calculated deception laid out in charts and graphs and bank records, was both validating and heartbreaking. This wasn't a case of poor judgment or family miscommunication. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had targeted vulnerable seniors with the precision of a military operation. The most powerful testimony came from the other victims, and hearing Mrs. Price, Mr. Chen, and Dorothy Fleming describe their experiences in their own words brought tears to my eyes and visible discomfort to several jury members. Mrs. Price, now 82 and using a walker, testified about the isolation and despair she had felt when everyone around her believed she was losing her mind. "I started to think maybe I really was going crazy," she said in a voice that shook with emotion. "When your own family starts looking at you like you're not all there anymore, you begin to doubt everything you know about yourself. That's the cruelest part of what they did to us. They didn't just steal our money, they stole our sense of reality." Mr. Chen's testimony revealed the devastating impact the crimes had had on his small business and his relationships with his children, who had initially believed Jerome's lies about their father's declining mental state. "I built that business over 30 years, he said, his voice breaking as he described watching his life's work crumble under the weight of Jerome's character assassination. But losing the money wasn't the worst part. The worst part was seeing my own children look at me like I was a stranger, like the man who raised them had disappeared and been replaced by someone they couldn't trust or respect." Dorothy Fleming's testimony was perhaps the most heartbreaking because it revealed the spiritual dimension of the abuse she had suffered. "I thought I was honoring my sister's memory by creating that scholarship foundation," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Instead, I became complicit in my own humiliation. Every Sunday I sat in church, knowing that people were whispering about poor Dorothy, who had lost her mind and was making wild accusations against that nice young man who was just trying to help her. They made me doubt not just my memory, but my judgment, my character, my very worth as a human being." When my turn came to testify, I had prepared extensively with the prosecutors, but nothing could have truly prepared me for the emotional impact of facing Jerome across a courtroom and speaking publicly about the most painful betrayal of my life. I looked directly at him as I was sworn in, searching his face for any sign of remorse or recognition of the pain he had caused. But all I saw was the same calculating indifference that had replaced the loving grandson I thought I knew. "Mrs. Washington," Assistant U.S. Attorney Martinez began gently, "can you please tell the jury about your relationship with the defendant, Jerome Washington?" I took a deep breath and began what felt like the most important speech of my life. "Jerome is my grandson, the son of my daughter Patricia, who died in a car accident when he was 7 years old. I raised him from that day forward, and I loved him more than I loved my own life. I worked double shifts as a nurse for 15 years to put him through college, and I gave him every penny of my savings because I believed in his dreams and his future." As I spoke, I could see several jury members looking back and forth between me and Jerome, trying to reconcile the loving relationship I described with the systematic abuse that had been documented in the evidence. The prosecution walked me through the timeline of Jerome's deception, from the initial lies about his business to the sophisticated gaslighting campaign that had nearly destroyed my sense of reality. "Mrs. Washington," Martinez asked, "can you describe for the jury what it felt like to have your own grandson tell people that you were losing your mind?" I paused, feeling the weight of that question and the importance of helping the jury understand the psychological torture I had endured. "It's like having someone erase you while you're still alive," I said finally. "When the person you trust most in the world starts telling everyone that you can't be trusted, that your thoughts and memories aren't real, it makes you question everything you know about yourself. It's a special kind of cruelty that goes beyond stealing money. They steal your identity, your relationships, your place in the world." The cross-examination by Jerome's attorney was exactly as brutal as the prosecutors had warned me it would be, with David Hartley attempting to portray me as a vindictive grandmother who was exaggerating the impact of what he characterized as a family financial dispute. "Mrs. Washington," he said, in a tone that was superficially respectful but clearly designed to suggest I was an unreliable witness, "isn't it true that you had been having some memory issues before any of these alleged incidents occurred?" I looked him directly in the eyes, drawing on 68 years of experience dealing with people who underestimated me, and responded with the clarity and strength I had maintained throughout this entire ordeal. "Mr. Hartley," I said, my voice steady and strong, "my memory is perfect. I remember every lie your client told me, every manipulation he used against me, and every moment of pain he caused, not just me, but every other victim sitting in this courtroom today. If you'd like to test my memory, I'd be happy to recite every conversation we had that was recorded by federal agents, including the ones where he and his accomplice discussed expanding their operation to target more elderly victims." The lawyer's confident expression faltered slightly, and I could see him realize that his strategy of attacking my credibility was not going to be effective against someone who had documented everything with the precision of the medical professional I had been for 3 decades. The testimony about Jerome and Madison's future plans was particularly damning, as federal agents played recordings of conversations where they discussed scaling up their operation to target seniors in assisted living facilities and retirement communities across multiple states. In one particularly chilling recording, Madison could be heard explaining to Jerome how they could use social media and public records to identify wealthy elderly individuals who lived alone and had minimal family contact. "The key is volume," Madison's voice said through the courtroom speakers. "If we can process 20 or 30 marks simultaneously, we can generate serious money before any of them figure out what's happening." The moment that changed everything for me came when Jerome finally took the stand in his own defense, and I saw clearly what kind of man he had chosen to become. His attorney had coached him to express remorse and take responsibility for his actions, but the words that came out of his mouth revealed someone who was sorry, only that he had been caught. "I know I made mistakes," he said, his voice taking on the same manipulative tone I had learned to recognize during our final confrontations. "I was young and stupid, and I let Madison convince me to do things I knew were wrong, but I never meant to hurt my grandmother. Everything I did was because I was worried about her getting older and making poor financial decisions." Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, even after months of prosecution testimony and victim impact statements, Jerome was still trying to gaslight the jury and maintain the fiction that he had been motivated by concern rather than greed. "I love my grandmother," he continued, looking directly at me with what appeared to be genuine emotion, but which I now recognized as practiced manipulation. "I know she's angry with me now, and I understand why, but I hope someday she'll forgive me and understand that everything I did came from a place of love." The audacity of using the word love to describe systematic abuse and theft was breathtaking, and I felt my hands clench into fists as I struggled to maintain my composure. Madison's testimony was even more revealing, as she showed absolutely no remorse for the psychological torture she had inflicted on multiple elderly victims. When asked about the impact her actions had had on people like Mrs. Price and Mr. Chen, she responded with clinical detachment, describing their suffering as unfortunate but necessary consequences of protecting them from their own poor judgment. Her complete lack of empathy was stunning to witness, and I could see several jury members recoil as she spoke about elderly victims as if they were objects to be managed rather than human beings deserving of respect and dignity. The closing arguments brought everything into sharp focus, with the prosecution emphasizing the systematic nature of the crimes and the devastating impact on victims who had lost not just money, but their sense of safety and belonging in their own communities. "Ladies and gentlemen," Assistant U.S. Attorney Martinez said in her final appeal to the jury, "this case is about more than financial fraud. It's about a conspiracy to systematically destroy the lives of vulnerable seniors by stealing not just their money, but their credibility, their relationships, and their peace of mind. The defendants didn't just commit theft, they committed psychological warfare against people who deserved protection and care." The defense's closing arguments were predictably focused on minimizing the defendant's culpability and suggesting that the prosecution was seeking disproportionate punishment for what they characterized as poor judgment rather than criminal intent. But after weeks of testimony and evidence, it was clear that the jury had seen through the manipulation and understood the true nature of what Jerome and Madison had done to their victims. The verdict came after only 6 hours of deliberation, and as the jury foreman stood to read the results, I felt my heart pounding with anticipation and anxiety about whether justice would finally be served. On the count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, we find the defendant, Jerome Washington, guilty. On the count of elder financial abuse, we find the defendant, Jerome Washington, guilty. On the count of identity theft, we find the defendant, Jerome Washington, guilty. The pattern continued through all 18 federal charges, and by the time the foreman finished reading, Jerome was facing a potential sentence of over 40 years in federal prison. Madison's verdict was equally comprehensive, with guilty findings on all 23 charges, including racketeering, money laundering, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. As the judge thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for the following month, I felt a sense of vindication that was both satisfying and deeply sad. Justice had been served, but it couldn't restore the relationships that had been destroyed or eliminate the trauma that multiple families had endured. The sentencing hearing was my final opportunity to address Jerome directly, and I had spent weeks preparing a victim impact statement that I hoped would help him understand the full scope of what he had done to the people who loved him. Your Honor, I began, standing at the podium in the same courtroom where the truth had finally been revealed. I want to address both the court and my grandson about the impact his crimes have had, not just on me, but on every victim who trusted him with their security and their dignity. I looked directly at Jerome, who was sitting with his head down, apparently unable to meet my eyes. Jerome, I said, my voice carrying across the silent courtroom, I want you to understand that what you stole from me wasn't just money. You stole my ability to trust, my sense of safety in my own community, my confidence in my own judgment. You made me question my sanity and doubt my worth as a human being. But most importantly, you stole something that can never be replaced. The relationship between a grandmother and the grandson she loved more than her own life. I paused, feeling the weight of those words and the finality of what I was saying. The boy I raised and loved doesn't exist anymore, if he ever existed at all. The man sitting in that chair is a stranger who wears his face, but has none of his heart. The sentences that Judge Patricia Morrison handed down reflected the seriousness of the crimes and the need to protect other potential victims from similar predators. Jerome received 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, while Madison received 35 years for her role as the mastermind of the criminal enterprise. As I listened to the judge explain the reasoning behind the sentences, emphasizing the vulnerability of the victims and the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy, I felt a sense of closure beginning to develop for the first time since this nightmare had begun. But the most surprising moment of the entire legal process came after the sentencing, when Jerome's attorney approached me in the courthouse hallway and handed me a letter that Jerome had written but been too ashamed to deliver personally. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and found 3 pages of handwritten text that began with the words I had been waiting months to hear. Grandma, I'm sorry. The letter went on to express genuine remorse for his actions and acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, but it also contained something I hadn't expected: information about other victims and criminal associates that could help law enforcement prevent similar crimes in the future. Reading Jerome's letter in the privacy of my home that evening, I realized that the young man I had raised was still somewhere inside the criminal he had become, and that realization changed everything about how I wanted to spend the remaining years of my life. Instead of retreating into isolation and bitterness, I decided to use my experience to help other seniors recognize and protect themselves from similar predators. I began working with Detective Santos and federal prosecutors to develop educational programs for elderly communities, sharing my story and teaching others to recognize the warning signs of financial abuse and psychological manipulation. The foundation I established in Patricia's memory became a powerful force for protecting vulnerable seniors, providing legal assistance to victims of elder abuse, and funding research into the psychological tactics used by predators who target elderly individuals. Working with Mrs. Price, Mr. Chen, Dorothy Fleming, and dozens of other survivors, we created a support network that helped victims recover not just financially, but emotionally from the trauma of betrayal and abuse. 6 months after Jerome's sentencing, I received my first letter from him in prison, and I was surprised to find that I felt ready to read it and perhaps even respond. The young man who wrote to me from federal prison was different from the calculating predator who had stolen my life savings and tried to destroy my sanity. He was taking responsibility for his actions, participating in rehabilitation programs, and working to help law enforcement identify other criminal operations that targeted elderly victims. The healing process hasn't been easy or complete, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully forgive Jerome for what he did to me and the other victims. But I've learned that healing doesn't require forgiveness, and justice doesn't require hatred. I've learned that even the worst betrayals can become opportunities to protect others and create positive change in the world. Today, 3 years after Jerome's arrest, I live in a beautiful retirement community where I'm surrounded by friends who know my story and respect my strength. I travel around the country, speaking to senior groups about protecting themselves from financial predators, and I've helped law enforcement agencies in 12 states identify and prosecute similar criminal operations. My experience taught me that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to choose whether we'll be defined by what others do to us or by how we respond to the challenges we face. The most important lesson I want to share with anyone listening to this story is that age doesn't make us weak, and trusting others doesn't make us foolish. The criminals who target elderly individuals are sophisticated predators who exploit our desire to help family members and trust the people we love. But we're stronger than they think we are, smarter than they give us credit for, and more resilient than even we sometimes realize. If you or someone you love is experiencing something similar to what I went through, please know that help is available and justice is possible. Don't let anyone convince you that you're too old to fight back or too confused to be believed. Document everything, trust your instincts, and remember that seeking help isn't a sign of weakness, but a demonstration of the strength and wisdom that comes with experience. And if my story has touched you in any way, please share it with others who might need to hear it, because awareness is our best defense against the predators who count on our silence and isolation to protect them from the consequences of their crimes. Subscribe to hear more stories of survivors who refuse to be victims, and remember that no matter what challenges you face, you have the power to write your own ending. Jerome will spend the next 22 years in federal prison, and Madison will likely never be released. But I'll spend my remaining years using my freedom to protect others and prove that even the worst betrayals can't destroy a spirit that refuses to be broken. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about transformation, protection, and the power to turn our pain into purpose.